At Chuck E. Cheese, I took pictures with Chucky, and he whispered, "Does your mom know who I am? I don't even know who you are." I thought Chucky wasn't supposed to speak. I looked up at his plastic eyes, confused. The mouse mascot made sure no one was looking before whispering back, "Why don't you follow me, sweetie?" Something felt off, but I was only 8 and curious about why Chucky was breaking character. He led me away from the photo area, past the skee-ball machines, and toward the back of the restaurant. My mom was busy talking to another parent near the pizza counter and didn't notice us leaving. We went through a door marked employees only and down a hallway that smelled like old pizza grease. Chucky finally stopped near what looked like a break room and knelt down to my level. "In the future, you should never follow strangers, especially not Mickey Mouse. Bad things can happen." His voice was muffled through the costume head. I felt scared, suddenly realizing I'd followed a stranger away from the party. But before I could run, he pulled out a white envelope from somewhere in his costume. It was thick, like it had a lot of papers inside and sealed with tape. Maybe it was money? "Don't open this, just make sure you give it straight to your mom." He held it out to me. "What is this? Is it money?" I took the envelope reluctantly. "It's a special gift for your mommy. She'll love it." The way he said it didn't sound like he meant it. Chucky stood up and led me back to the main restaurant. As soon as we came through the employee door, he walked away quickly, disappearing into the kitchen. I stood there holding the envelope, wondering what just happened. My mom found me a minute later looking frantic. She kept asking where I was, but the second I told her and held up the envelope, her face changed. She grabbed my shoulders and asked what happened. When I explained, her expression went from worried to angry to scared all in a few seconds. She marched over to a Chuck E. Cheese worker and demanded to know which employee was in the Chucky costume. The teenager looked confused and called for a manager. Within minutes, there was a whole group of employees surrounding us. The manager was asking questions and calling someone on his walkie-talkie. "What's in the envelope?" Mom asked, even though Chucky had said not to open it. "It's a gift for you." I still thought maybe it was birthday money or something nice. Mom ripped open the envelope right there in front of everyone. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out a stack of official-looking papers. She read the first page and let out a scream that made everyone in the arcade turn to look at us. "Who the hell is under that Chucky costume?" she was yelling now. The manager had found the person in the Chucky suit and brought him over. 2 other employees held his arms like they thought he might run. The whole restaurant was watching now. Kids had stopped playing games. Parents were pulling their children closer. Someone reached up and pulled off the Chucky head. Underneath was a man with brown hair and tired eyes. I recognized him immediately, even though I hadn't seen him in 2 years. It was my father. The one Mom said had moved far away with a hot new girlfriend. "You've been served!" The manager grabbed his walkie-talkie and started calling for security while the 2 teenage employees kept their hands on my father's arms. Parents all around us were grabbing their kids and pulling them away from our area. Some lady near the prize counter asked if someone should call the police. My father started talking really loud about how he'd tried everything else to give my mother these papers. He said she kept hiding from the process servers and wouldn't answer the door. The manager told him to save it for the cops and started telling someone on his radio to lock all the doors so nobody could leave. My chest felt tight and tears started coming down my face. I didn't understand why my dad was here or why everyone was so mad. My mother pulled me against her side and held me tight while staring at my father with this look I'd never seen before. She told me everything was okay and that Daddy had done something very bad. That made me cry even harder because I didn't know what was happening. The police showed up really fast, maybe 10 minutes after the manager called them. 2 officers came in first and started asking everyone what happened. My father had to sit on a bench near the birthday party area with his hands behind his back. My mother had to tell the whole story 3 different times to 3 different cops. She kept pointing at the papers and then at me and then at my father. One officer wrote everything down in a little notebook while another one talked into his radio. More parents were leaving with their kids now, and the whole restaurant felt weird and quiet, except for the police radios making noise. The officers didn't put handcuffs on my father, but they told him he had to leave right away. The manager said the restaurant was going to press charges for trespassing. My father kept trying to look at me and say something, but the officers stood between us. My mother told them she wanted a restraining order and that he wasn't allowed near us. We had to go out the back door by the kitchen while other families watched us. I could hear little kids asking their parents what was going on. My mother picked me up and carried me even though I was way too big for that. Her whole body was shaking as she walked to the car. She put me in the back seat and buckled me in like I was a baby. I still had a Chuck E. Cheese token in my hand from earlier. My mother got in the front and called her sister right away. She was using all these words I didn't know, like process server and custody and jurisdiction. Her voice kept breaking like she was trying not to cry. She told my aunt the whole story while driving home, and I just sat there looking at that token. When we got home, my mother sat me down on the couch and tried to explain what happened. She said Daddy wanted to change the rules about when he could see me. She said he had tricked me into helping him do something sneaky, and that wasn't fair to me. She kept saying it wasn't my fault, but I still felt bad. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I kept seeing my father's face when they pulled off that costume head. He looked so tired and sad and different from how I remembered him. My mother came to check on me 3 times, and each time her eyes were red and puffy. She'd sit on my bed and rub my back, but I could tell she'd been crying too. 20 years went by before I really understood what happened that day. I was helping my mother clean out her storage unit when I found this box with Legal 2004 written on it in black marker. Inside was that same white envelope from the Chuck E. Cheese. My hands shook when I picked it up. The weight of it brought everything back like it was yesterday. All those papers were still inside, along with court documents and lawyer letters I'd never seen before. My mother saw me holding it and got really quiet. She said I could look through it all if I wanted to know the truth. She warned me it might change how I thought about things. That night, I spread everything across my kitchen table, trying to understand what my father had actually been trying to do back then. The divorce papers weren't asking for full custody like I'd always thought. He just wanted joint custody and regular visits. There were pages and pages of legal stuff about child support and visitation schedules. I found receipts showing he'd been paying support, even though it was sometimes late. There were letters from his lawyer talking about failed attempts to serve papers the normal way. Process servers had gone to our house 6 times, according to the records. One wrote that my mother wouldn't answer the door even though her car was there. Another one said she claimed to be someone else when they found her at the grocery store. The more I read, the more confused I got about what really happened and why my parents couldn't just talk to each other like adults. I picked up the phone and called my mother to ask if I could look through all the papers properly. She went quiet for a long time before finally saying I was old enough to know the truth if I wanted it. She warned me it might change how I saw things, but admitted I needed to understand what really happened. That night, I spread the papers across my kitchen table and started reading through all the legal language carefully. The documents were asking for joint custody and structured visits, not the full custody I'd always assumed my father wanted. I found the case number on one of the forms and decided to look up the public court records online. After typing in the number, I discovered a whole filing history I never knew existed with dozens of documents spanning 3 years. There were motions and responses and court orders going back and forth between lawyers for months. The first thing I learned was that my father had tried to serve my mother with papers 6 different times before the Chuck E. Cheese incident. Process servers had gone to our house, my mother's work, and even my grandmother's house. But somehow they never succeeded. I found an affidavit from a process server saying my mother refused to answer the door, even though her car was in the driveway. Another one said she claimed to be someone else when they approached her at the grocery store. The documents showed dates and times and addresses where they'd tried to find her. I called my mother and asked her directly why she avoided being served all those times. She got defensive right away, saying my father had disappeared for months with his girlfriend before all this started. She reminded me he hadn't paid child support regularly and had drinking problems that made him unreliable. Her voice got louder as she listed all the reasons she didn't trust him with regular visits. I went back to the records and started looking deeper into the financial documents. I found payment receipts showing my father actually was paying support, though it was irregular and sometimes late. There was also a letter from him requesting makeup time for missed visits due to work travel. The letter sounded desperate, asking for any chance to see me, even if just for a few hours. I sat there for a while thinking about what to do next, before deciding to reach out to my father through email. I kept it simple, just saying I'd found some old documents and had questions about what happened. I made it clear I wasn't choosing sides, but was just trying to understand the whole situation. My hands shook a little as I typed his email address from one of the court documents. Going back through the court files, I found that a guardian ad litem named Sunita Wong was appointed to represent my interests during the custody dispute. Her report recommended structured visits with both parents and noted that both seemed to love me but couldn't communicate with each other. She wrote about interviewing me when I was 7 and how confused I seemed about why I couldn't see my father. The report had details about both parents' homes and their ability to take care of me. Within just a few hours, my father responded to my email saying he'd been sober for 15 years and would answer any questions I had. He included his phone number but said he understood if I preferred to stick to email for now. His message was short, but sounded grateful that I'd reached out after all this time. I printed out his response and added it to the growing pile of papers on my table. The stack was getting bigger as I found more documents online and printed everything that seemed important. Each new piece of information made the story more complicated than the simple version I'd always believed. My mother had always made it sound like my father just left us for another woman and didn't care. But these papers showed someone fighting hard to stay in my life even when it seemed impossible. The court records had timestamps showing he'd filed motions every few months trying to get visits. There were requests for phone calls, for holiday visits, for anything that would let him see me. Each one had been fought by my mother's lawyer, with arguments about his past behavior and why he wasn't safe. I found medical records showing he'd completed a rehab program and had clean drug tests for months before the Chuck E. Cheese incident. There were certificates from parenting classes he'd taken and anger management courses he'd completed on his own. Everything pointed to someone trying really hard to fix their mistakes and be a better parent. The more I read, the more I realized how much energy both my parents had spent fighting each other instead of figuring things out. There were hundreds of pages of legal arguments that probably cost thousands of dollars in lawyer fees. All that money and time that could have been spent on making things better for everyone. I started making notes about what questions I wanted to ask both of them when we talked next. There were so many gaps in the story and so many things that didn't make sense now that I could see both sides. The next morning, I went back to the court website and started searching through every single document in the case file, clicking on PDFs one by one until I found what looked like the first major motion filed by my mother's side. The document was titled Motion for Sole Custody, and the attorney listed was Aisha Cole from Cole and Associates Family Law. I printed it out and started reading through the legal language, which basically painted my father as someone who'd abandoned his family for another woman and couldn't be trusted with a child. The words were harsh, calling him unstable and dangerous, saying he'd show no interest in maintaining a relationship with me until it was convenient for him. I kept reading and found accusations about his drinking, his temper, and how he'd chosen his new girlfriend over his responsibilities as a father. The motion requested sole custody with no visitation rights at all, arguing that any contact would be harmful to my development and emotional well-being. I flipped to the next document in the file and found a response from my father's attorney, Edward Grant, which told a completely different story. He'd attached 12 different exhibits showing attempted visits that were denied, including dates, times, and screenshots of text messages my father had sent asking to see me. The texts started out calm and reasonable, asking for just an hour or two, then got more desperate as months went by without any response. There were messages like, "Please just let me take her to the park," and "I miss my daughter," and finally, "Why won't you let me see her?" repeated over and over. Grant's response also included witness statements from neighbors who'd seen my father sitting in his car outside our house for hours, waiting for a chance to see me that never came. I found another document showing the court had ordered my father to complete parenting classes and anger management as a condition for any future visitation. The next page had certificates showing he'd actually done it all, completing 16 weeks of parenting classes at the community center and 12 sessions of anger management with a licensed therapist. There was also documentation that he'd been attending AA meetings regularly, with a sponsor's letter saying he'd been sober for 6 months before the Chucky E. Cheese incident even happened. I called my mother and asked her about all this, and at first she got defensive, but when I pressed her with specific dates and documents, her voice changed. She admitted she was scared of him getting partial custody because of his drinking history, and because she didn't trust his new girlfriend around me. She kept saying she was protecting me, but her voice didn't sound as certain as it used to, and I could hear her moving around the kitchen nervously while we talked. After we hung up, I looked up Sunita Wong's contact information from the Guardian ad litem report and found she was still practicing family law at the same firm downtown. I called her office, and amazingly, she answered the phone herself and remembered our case immediately when I explained who I was. She agreed to meet with me the following week, saying it was one of those cases that had stuck with her over the years because of how it ended. I went back to the court documents and kept digging until I found a police report from 2 years before the birthday party that I'd never known existed. The report described my father showing up at our house drunk at 2 in the morning, banging on the door and demanding to see me while my mother called 911. The officers had to physically remove him from the property, and he'd been given a warning about trespassing. Reading it in official police language made it real in a way my mother's stories never had, and I understood better why she'd been so scared of him having access to me. That evening, Edward Grant returned my voicemail from earlier in the day, and we talked for almost an hour about what had really happened. He explained that the Chuck E. Cheese service was a last resort after months of failed attempts through proper channels, and that my father had been desperate to establish some kind of legal visitation schedule. He said my father knew it was a terrible choice, but felt he had no other options left, and that he'd never intended to traumatize anyone, especially not me. Grant also mentioned that my father had been sober for over a year at that point and was trying to rebuild his life. I spent the rest of the night going through financial documents in the file, finding records showing my father had fallen behind on child support when he lost his job at the warehouse, but had set up a payment plan to catch up. There was evidence of wage garnishment that lasted 8 months, taking half his paycheck from his new job to cover the back support plus interest. The documents showed he'd eventually paid everything he owed, though it had taken him almost 2 years to get current. I pulled out my journal and started writing down everything I'd learned, trying to make sense of all the conflicting information. Both my parents had made mistakes and bad choices, fighting each other through lawyers instead of figuring out how to co-parent. Neither was the villain or hero I'd imagined them to be, just 2 flawed people caught in a messy situation that spiraled out of control. The next morning, I sent my father an email saying I was willing to meet him in person if he was interested. I suggested a coffee shop downtown and set clear boundaries about keeping it to an hour and sticking to certain topics. He responded within minutes, agreeing to everything I'd asked for and suggesting we meet that Saturday afternoon. When Saturday came, I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early and sat at a corner table where I could see the door. My hands were shaking as I waited, checking my phone every few seconds and second-guessing my decision to meet him. When he finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize him because he looked so much older, but also somehow healthier than that day at Chuck E. Cheese, with gray in his hair but clear eyes and steady hands. He stood up from his chair and walked around the small table to sit in the seat right next to me. His hands were shaking as he reached into a worn backpack he'd brought with him. He pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been written and rewritten many times. "I'm sorry for what I did at your birthday party." His voice cracked on the word sorry. He pushed the paper across the table, but kept his hand on it for a second before letting go. I could see water building up in his eyes as he rubbed his face with both hands. He told me it was the worst thing he'd ever done in his life. The coffee shop was getting busier around us, but I barely noticed the noise. He kept wiping his eyes with a napkin, and his shoulders were shaking a little. I believed him when he said he was sorry for making me part of their fight. He reached back into his backpack and pulled out a small cardboard box held together with rubber bands. The box was beat up and had water stains on one corner like it had been through a lot. He set it on the table between us and slowly took off the rubber bands. Inside were birthday cards stacked up with the newest ones on top. Each envelope had my name written on it, and a date in the corner. He spread them out on the table, and I counted 12 cards total. Some of the envelopes were thick, like they had more than just a card inside. He explained he bought one every year, but never had our address to send them. I picked up the oldest one from when I turned 9 and opened it carefully. Inside was a card with a cartoon dinosaur and a long letter written in blue pen. The letter talked about how much he missed me and hoped I was doing okay in the school. The next card had another letter asking if I still liked soccer and telling me about his new job. Each card had gotten thicker over the years with longer and longer letters inside them. Some had photos of places he'd been or tickets for movies he wished we could have seen together. One had a $20 bill still taped inside with a note saying to buy something fun. He started talking about his drinking problem while I was still looking through the cards. He said it got really bad after the divorce papers were filed. He'd lost his job at the warehouse because he kept showing up late or not at all. The drinking got worse when the court said he couldn't see me without supervision. He wasn't making excuses, but just laying out what happened year by year. He showed me a bronze chip from AA with the number 15 on it. He'd been going to meetings 3 times a week for over a decade now. His sponsor had helped him get the job he has now at a shipping company. He said getting sober was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but losing me was what made him finally do it. I left the coffee shop with the box of cards and drove straight to the courthouse. The clerk's office was still open, and I asked to see more records from our case. I found a mediation agreement dated a year after the Chuck E. Cheese incident. The document showed both my parents had agreed to supervise visits at a family center. The visits were supposed to happen every other Saturday for 2 hours each time. There were signatures from both parents and their lawyers, plus the mediator. The record showed these visits actually happened for 6 months, with reports filed each time. But then they just stopped with no explanation in the official documents. I called Sunita Wong's office, and she agreed to meet me for lunch the next day. We met at a sandwich shop near the courthouse where she still worked. She remembered everything about our case, including specific dates and court hearings. She described my parents as 2 scared people who loved me, but couldn't see past their anger. Your best interests got lost in their need to win. She shook her head while saying it. She told me about meetings where they'd argue about tiny details for hours. Neither parent would give an inch on anything, no matter how small. She'd recommended family therapy multiple times, but they both refused. That evening, I went to my mother's house with printouts of the mediation agreement. I asked her directly about the supervised visits that had stopped after 6 months. She got quiet and started cleaning the already clean kitchen counter with a dish rag. Finally, she admitted she'd started making excuses about why we couldn't go. First, I was supposedly sick. Then we had other plans. Then she just stopped showing up. She said my father had seemed different during those visits, but couldn't give me specific examples. She kept saying the word unstable, but wouldn't explain what she meant by it. I spent the next morning at the police station requesting old records. The desk sergeant helped me find 2 wellness check reports from that same time period. Both had been called in by my mother, saying she was concerned about my father's mental state. The first officer's report said they found nothing concerning at his apartment. The second report used almost the same words about finding a sad but sober man living alone. Neither report mentioned any signs of danger or mental health issues. I met my father again that afternoon at the same coffee shop. I asked him about those supervised visits and why they really stopped. He stared at his coffee cup for a long time before answering. He said I'd been scared of him after being apart for so long. Every visit I'd cry and want to leave early, even though he tried bringing toys and books. The social worker had suggested maybe taking a break and trying again later. He said stopping them felt mutual at the time, but he regretted it immediately. He'd written letters to the court asking to restart visits, but never got responses. A week later, I confronted my mother again about things she'd told me over the years. This time, I had a list of specific statements she'd made about my father. After going through several items, she finally admitted not everything had been completely true. She said she'd told me he chose his new girlfriend over me, which wasn't what really happened. The girlfriend had actually encouraged him to fight for custody according to the court documents. She admitted she was angry and hurt and wanted me to take her side. She said she needed me to be her ally in the whole mess. The next day, I asked both parents to meet me at a neutral location. We sat at a picnic table in a public park with people walking by. I told them I wouldn't be a messenger between them anymore about anything. If they had issues with each other, they needed to handle it directly. They both nodded and said they understood, but I could see they were uncomfortable. Neither of them looked at each other during the entire conversation. I pulled out my phone and started typing a text to both of them about finding a family therapist. My mother's face got tight when she read it, but she nodded slowly. My father said yes right away, and even offered to pay for the sessions. We found someone who specialized in divorced families and scheduled our first appointment for the following week. The therapist's office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax place. We all arrived separately and sat in different corners of the waiting room like strangers. The therapist was an older woman with gray hair who introduced herself and led us to a room with 4 chairs arranged in a square. Nobody wanted to sit first, so we all stood there awkwardly until she pointed to specific seats. My mother kept her purse in her lap like a shield, while my father sat on the edge of his chair. The therapist started by explaining ground rules about respect and taking turns speaking. She asked each of us to say why we were there without blaming anyone else. My father went first and talked about wanting to repair relationships and move forward. My mother's turn was shorter, and she mostly talked about supporting me. When it was my turn, I said I just wanted us to stop being stuck in the past. The rest of that first session was mostly the therapist asking basic questions about our history. Nobody raised their voice or stormed out, which felt like progress, even though the silences were painful. She gave us homework to think about what we each wanted from these sessions. The second session started with my father clearing his throat and saying he had something important to share. He looked at me and admitted he'd used serving the custody papers as an excuse to see me. He knew it was wrong and manipulative, but he was desperate to be part of my birthday. My mother's jaw clenched, but she waited her turn to speak. When she did, she admitted she'd made the incident bigger than it needed to be. She wanted to punish him for scaring me and used it as ammunition in court. The therapist helped us see how both reactions came from fear and pain rather than evil intentions. During the third session, we worked on creating a plan for moving forward. The therapist had a big whiteboard where she wrote down agreements we all made. My father and I would have structured contact, starting with coffee meetings every 2 weeks. My mother agreed not to interfere or ask for details about our meetings. We set boundaries about what topics were off limits and what situations would require communication between my parents. The therapist typed everything up and printed copies for each of us to sign. It wasn't legally binding, but it felt official having it in writing. Between sessions, my father had been working on something he wanted to give me. At our 4th session, he pulled out an envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to 8-year-old me apologizing for the birthday party incident. He wrote about how scared and confused I must have been and how sorry he was for putting me in that position. The letter explained that grown-ups sometimes make bad choices when they're hurting. He said I didn't do anything wrong by following him or giving Mom the envelope. At the bottom, he wrote that I could keep the letter or throw it away, whatever felt right. I folded it carefully and put it in my wallet. My mother watched this exchange and then made her own commitment. She promised to stop telling the Chuck E. Cheese story in a way that made my father sound dangerous. If anyone asked about it, she'd stick to basic facts without the dramatic details she'd added over the years. She admitted she'd enjoyed making him the villain because it made her feel like the hero. The therapist helped her see how this hurt me by making me feel like half my DNA came from a monster. After 6 sessions, we decided to take a break and see how things went on our own. I spent an afternoon at the courthouse going through old records to verify everything was legally resolved. The child support obligations had been fulfilled 3 years ago, according to the final court order. There were no outstanding warrants or legal issues between my parents. Having official confirmation that all the old battles were truly over helped everyone relax. I showed both parents the documents, and we all felt relief seeing it in black and white. My father brought up something that had been bothering him for years. He pulled out his checkbook and wrote a check to my mother for $500. He said it was to reimburse her for the ruined birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese. My mother looked surprised but took the check without making a big deal about it. She even said thank you, which made my father's eyes get watery. It was such a small gesture, but it meant something to all of us. We started meeting for coffee every 2 weeks at a place halfway between our apartments. The first few meetings were stiff with lots of weather talk and sports scores. But gradually we found a rhythm of talking about current things rather than rehashing the past. He told me about his job at the shipping company, and I talked about my work. We avoided the painful topics and focused on building something new. These meetings started to feel almost normal after a couple months. My mother struggled more with the new arrangement than she expected. One evening, she admitted she felt anxious every time I left to meet him. She worried he'd disappoint me again, or that I'd choose him over her somehow. But instead of dumping these fears on me, she promised to discuss them with her own therapist. She'd started seeing someone to work through her own issues from the divorce. This boundary felt healthy for both of us, because I couldn't be her emotional support about my father anymore. The next week, I bought a big wall calendar and spent an afternoon marking all the important dates like my birthday and holidays and work events. I called both my parents separately and told them about the calendar idea so nobody would feel surprised by anything. My father seemed relieved to know when things were happening, and my mother admitted it would help her plan better. I took photos of each month and emailed them to both parents with a note saying this was how we'd handle scheduling from now on. 2 weeks later, my parents agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown to talk about boundaries and expectations. I wasn't there, but my mother texted me afterwards saying it went okay, and they'd written down some basic rules. My father sent me a photo of the paper they'd both signed, even though it wasn't legal or anything. The paper listed things like giving each other 48 hours notice before any shared events and not discussing past grievances at family gatherings. They'd also agreed to communicate through email only unless there was an emergency. I printed out the agreement and put it in the same folder with all the old court documents. A month later, when they started arguing over text about some old issue, I forwarded them both the contact info for a family mediator I'd found online. I told them I wouldn't be reading any more messages about their disputes, and if they needed to fight, they should pay someone else to listen. My mother called me upset, but I stuck to my boundary, and eventually she agreed to use the mediator if needed. My father just texted back, "Understood," which was typical for him. My graduation was coming up in May, and I sent both parents separate invitations with their seat assignments in different sections. The ceremony went smoothly with my father sitting on the left side of the auditorium and my mother on the right with her sister. They both took photos when I walked across the stage, and neither one tried to approach the other afterward. We did 2 separate dinners to celebrate, which felt weird but manageable. The next month, my mother suggested we drive by the old neighborhood, and I agreed even though it felt strange. When we got to where the Chuck E. Cheese used to be, we found an empty building with paper covering all the windows and a for lease sign out front. We parked in the empty lot and sat there for a few minutes just looking at it. My mother turned to me and said she was sorry for everything that happened there and for making me carry that memory all these years. She said she knew she'd made it worse by turning it into such a big story. I told her I understood she was protecting me the only way she knew how. We sat there for another 10 minutes before driving away, and neither of us has mentioned that place since. That night, I created a group text with both my parents and sent a message saying this was only for logistics and scheduling. My father responded first by sharing a photo from my graduation that he'd gotten developed. It was a nice shot of me shaking the dean's hand, and my mother surprised me by responding with a thumbs up emoji. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge after everything we'd been through. Over the next few months, we settled into this new normal, with everyone respecting the boundaries we'd set. My coffee meetings with my father became routine, and my mother stopped asking for details about them. The group text stayed boring with just schedule updates and occasional photos. 6 months after we'd started therapy, I could see how much had changed even though none of us were suddenly best friends or anything. My parents could be in the same room without drama even if they didn't talk to each other. They'd learned to be polite for my sake, which was more than I'd hoped for. The shared calendar meant no more surprise encounters, and the mediator's number meant I didn't have to solve their problems. Looking back at everything, I realized we'd never be the happy family from a movie where everyone hugs and laughs together at Sunday dinner. But we'd found our own way to exist in each other's lives, without all the old pain and anger controlling everything. My parents would probably never like each other, but they could both love me without making me choose sides. The boundaries we'd created weren't walls keeping us apart, but more like guidelines helping us stay connected safely. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest and respectful, and after 20 years of chaos, that felt like its own kind of success. Well, that's gonna wrap it up for me today. Kinda makes you stop and think about things, huh? Appreciate you hanging out and wondering through it all with me. Subscribe for more content like this.